Well, as all three speakers are here and it's just gone 10 o'clock, let's get this event started. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is David Fagelman and I am an advocacy associate at the Finance Innovation Lab. For those of you who aren't familiar with the lab's work, the lab's a charity that builds power to transform the financial system for people and planet. And today we're going to talk about the Kalifa Review and ask if the Kalifa Review went far enough to promote financial inclusion and sustainability. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with Zoom, but just some housekeeping at the moment to start us off. If you are not one of our fabulous speakers, please can you keep yourself on mute and turn your cameras off. We are recording this event and we would really like you to send through as many questions as you'd like. To do that, send them through chat. If you send them through chat, we'll review them and we'll pick them up as presenters finish the discussions, but also at the end of the session. You can tweet about this event. Let's get some conversation going on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @thefinancelab. If you want to use a hashtag, you could use hashtag Kalifa Review, or it is UK Fintech Week, so you could use hashtag UKFW21 and put what we're talking about in social media. I'm going to move on to our speakers in a moment, but just to warm everyone up, let's have a poll. So Yvonne, if you could launch our polls just to get the juices flowing, we're going to ask for your views on some very important issues. The first is, do you think that the Kalifa Review did enough to address financial inclusion, sustainability, and truly transform fintech? Yes, no, or don't know. And the second question is, do you think that the government needs to do more to ensure that fintech has a focus on financial inclusion and sustainability? Yes, no, or don't know. I'll give everyone a moment there to vote. It's all anonymous, so don't worry, we won't be calling anyone out on how they voted today. I'm just putting my votes in as well, actually. There we go, submit. Okay, everyone cast your votes, and Yvonne, if you could post the results and we can see how everyone feels this morning on this topic. There we go. So 69% of you don't think that the Kalifa Review did enough to address financial inclusion, sustainability, and truly transform fintech. 10% of you did, and a fifth of you are sitting on the fence, don't know. Well, hopefully we can, by the end of today's event, we can have a fifth of you in the yes or no column. And pretty much everyone thinks that the government needs to do more to ensure that fintech has a focus on financial inclusion and sustainability. Well, that's what our audience think. I'm going to hand over now to Marluce Nichols from the Finance Innovation Lab. Marluce is going to kick us off, and then we're going to go to Lord Chris Holmes, and then we're going to go to Kay Swinburne for some opening discussions, and then we'll bring the questions in and discuss it a bit more broadly. So Marluce, I'll hand over to you to start us off.
Thanks so much, David, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be able to discuss the Kalifa Review with you today and to share this platform with Lord Holmes and Kay during UK Fintech Week. So I'd like to start by saying that we really commend the review for putting forward a bold strategy for the UK's fintech sector. We absolutely need a world-class financial system, and we think the government needs to really lead on a comprehensive strategy that brings together the work of all the relevant regulators and departments responsible for finance, data, inclusion and more to ensure that the sector delivers the essential services that UK's citizens and businesses rely on to thrive. However, we do think the review could do more to ensure that the future of finance works for everyone. And we consulted civil society organisations in the lab's community following the publication of the review, and we developed 5 asks of government as it considers its next steps. So I'd like to just run through those with you now. So our first ask is about the need to develop policy and regulation in a way that's really transparent and accountable to the public. And we think that relying on the Kalifa Review to inform policy won't enable this because it is an industry-led review. And to be frank, it was directed by a millionaire who made his money from fintech, supported by a secretariat of industry trade bodies. Looking to the future, the review proposed a number of new bodies and groups, including a financial inclusion coalition, but worryingly, it repeatedly mentions that these will involve industry bodies alongside government, and we don't think that's enough. So in contrast, over the last year at the lab, we've engaged hundreds of third sector organisations who are interested in fintech, and they include civil society organisations, consumer groups, responsible finance providers, academics and others. And we really want to understand, how is the government going to work with us, as well as directly with members of the public, to ensure that policy and regulation develop in their interests and with the benefit of all of our relevant expertise. And I think the importance of ensuring our perspectives are included in policymaking is really reflected in our next 4 asks. So our second ask is that the government prioritises addressing financial and digital inclusion. And as a reminder, according to research by Lloyds Bank, nearly 12 million people in the UK don't have the essential skills to benefit from and participate in a digital society. And we've heard very little this week about how fintech is really going to work for those people. Now, the review does include recommendations related to financial inclusion, which is really great, but we are concerned that they get lost amongst the other more high profile recommendations, and ultimately that they get deprioritized. And we also think that the proposals could be strengthened given the importance of the issue of inclusion. And I really look forward to hearing Lord Holmes's views on this in a moment. But just to share something that particularly concerned me about the review, it failed to acknowledge the power of fintech to exacerbate exclusion. So in insurance, for example, the personalisation that fintech supports actually undermines the principle of mutual aid and risks making it more inaccessible to those who need it most. We need to make sure that when firms use new tech and data to assess risk and maximise their profits, that this doesn't come at the expense of people accessing essential services. And our third ask speaks to data in particular, or more specifically. So data lies at the heart of fintech, but I think there is a disconnect between the business potential for new data-driven services and what the public actually want and need. So we surveyed UK adults last month, and we found that most, over 2/3, are not comfortable about sharing their data to access financial services. And the review does seem to take us forward in some regards around building a more responsible data-driven financial system. For example, it speaks to the really important problems of automated bias and discrimination based on the use of data. But in some places, it seems to take us back some steps as well. For example, it states that the requirement for all data to be necessary for the purpose for which it's collected makes it difficult for firms to experiment. And on this, we really ask that the government commits to developing a regulatory framework for the use of data and AI that prioritises protecting people from harm and giving them agency about their data over speculative potential for innovation. Fourth, we think a healthy market is a diverse market that can provide a range of products that service or that cater every citizen in the UK. And at the lab, we think that purpose-driven firms like credit unions, like regional mutual banks, we think that they're best placed to use new tech to really deliver better services for all, as well as adding that layer of resilience to the financial system. But the odds against purpose-driven firms are massively stacked against them. And unless policymakers act to really radically shift the playing field to support them, we think that fintech will only bolster the power of big finance and big tech. And that's because those organisations have the resources to invest in the best tech, they have the size to benefit from economies of scale, as well as for-profit business models. That means they'll get a greater return on the use of that data and tech. And a massively undertold story at the moment is the growing relationship between finance and big tech. So our fifth ask, finally, we want UK Fintech to be developed as part of a wider finance strategy that also includes a commitment and plan for how the physical infrastructure, such as bank branches and cash, will continue to be supported. And that's because so many people still rely on that, and a majority would like to be able to use it. Last year, over 10 million people used cash more than once a week, and 2.5 million used it every day. And the highest predictor for cash reliance is poverty. So fintech, cash, we don't think these are separate issues, since the fast pace of digitization also puts pressure and contributes to the demise of physical service provision. So just to close, I think it is important to note that I think the review was always limited by its objectives to boost the growth and competitiveness of the fintech sector. So we would welcome a fresh look at fintech by the government that prioritises asking how the sector can contribute to our wider social and environmental goals, and that it involves civil society on an equal footing with the industry from the get-go. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. That great scene setter, and we've already got some questions coming on the chat, which we'll come to when we've had all three speakers. So please, people, let's keep them coming in. You've talked. It's UK Fintech Week. There's been loads of announcements this week. You wait for one, and they all come at the same time. You've talked about how the lab felt when the Kalifa review was published. The government's responded now, at least partially responded, with the Chancellor delivering the keynote on Monday at UK Fintech Week. Do you have any views on those announcements, and do they speak to any of the concerns that the lab has?
Great question. Yes, so the Chancellor made a number of announcements on Monday, and they really drew on the Kalifa review, and he confirmed his support for a number of the recommendations that were made to support the growth and competitiveness of the sector. I think three reflections from me based on our initial response are firstly that inclusion wasn't mentioned in his speech, nor fairness nor social issues. So I think he didn't really allay our concerns that issues like financial inclusion remain deprioritised. I think a second reflection is that there were a number of policies where I think there's a real opportunity to bring civil society in. For example, the new Centre for Financial Innovation and Technology, which is going to be working on a national and regional level. I think there's a real opportunity to involve local charities, community finance, and others in those discussions to make sure that fintech really works for local communities. And then third, I'm interested in how we might continue working together to strengthen some of those policy announcements to make sure that they don't just deliver growth, but they deliver social value. So for example, special visas have been announced for fintech staff, and I'd like to understand how we might make sure those visas actually support the growth of organisations that are going to help us achieve our climate goals or help us tackle financial inclusion. So could we add some more criteria to what sort of firms get access to those visas? That's just one example.
And more broadly, are you confident that things are going in the right direction? We've had the Kalifa review. The government's starting to respond to that. I know there's going to be more announcements coming out when the Chancellor makes a statement to Parliament. Maybe Kay can shed some light on some of that later on, perhaps. Do you think things are going in the right direction? And if so, what more do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think this conversation today is a really great sign of a positive direction. I'm really glad that we can discuss these issues together and with all the people who've joined the discussion as well. But yeah, I think there's just so much more to do, and I really want to make sure that social and environmental issues are front and centre of any strategy for the future of the financial system rather than an afterthought.
Okay, fabulous. There's a question here. I'm just going to this quick question here. Someone asked if the lab's going to be publishing the data you mentioned on, I think it was relating to people being unwilling to share their data. Do you think that would be possible for the lab to share that?
Yeah, definitely. That's on my to-do list. So we'll definitely put up a blog about that.
Fabulous. Okay, well, thanks very much, Marlise. That's a wonderful scene setter. I'm sure we'll no doubt come back to you later on as the questions come in. I'd now like to ask Lord Holmes if he could say a few words. As an intro, if people aren't familiar with Lord Chris Holmes, he is Britain's most successful Paralympic swimmer, but he is also a passionate advocate for the potential of technology and the benefits of diversity and inclusion. He's a very busy member of the House of Lords. He is co-chair of the APPG on FinTech and the APPG on AI, and he's been very busy recently tabling a number of amendments with regards to AI and financial inclusion in the House of Lords in the Financial Services Bill. So, Chris Holmes, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Marlise for a splendid start to this morning's proceedings. I feel that I am the somewhat suboptimal meat in a very fabulous sandwich. We've heard from Marlise. I'm merely the warm-up for Kay Swinburne, who, as many of you know, was the chapter lead for the policy and regulation chapter of the Kalifa review. And as we're amongst friends, it seems only right to say that the policy and regulation chapter was the best chapter of the Kalifa review, as you will hear in a few minutes. When considering this morning's event, I thought it might be helpful to go right back to first principles, really, and think, what are financial services for? And it seems to me that whether they are in the analog or the digital world, financial services are about inclusion, unleashing potential, enabling, and empowerment. And it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to suggest if financial services don't work for everyone, do they truly work for anyone? Key underpins to consider: there's an absolute pressing need for a distributed digital ID, inclusion, as already stated, and a real sense of how these issues thread together: financial inclusion, digital inclusion, social, economic, geographical inclusion, or indeed, if we take the other side of the coin, exclusion, all too often walking hand in hand, all too often combining to exacerbate somebody's situation and put down potential. In reality, financial inclusion, having dogged our nation for decades, an economic, a social, an individual, complete waste of talent and opportunity. And to the question which I think Marlise put, really, where is fintech when it comes to financial inclusion? Does fintech have something to say when it comes to financial inclusion? Can fintech help? Absolutely, unquestionably, the biggest yes you could imagine. But it's a can, it's conditional, it's in no sense inevitable, because as rightly identified by Marlise, potentially it could also exacerbate existing structures, existing paths of exclusion, shutting people out. But the potential is absolutely extraordinary. And again, to go back to first principles, what is fintech? What are 4IR technologies, AI, machine learning, DLT? They have phenomenal potential, but they are just the latest, and indeed right now the greatest tools that we have in our hands, the greatest tools we have in our well-washed hands. And it's down to us, all of us, what success or not we make when we deploy those tools, when we choose democratically, public debatedly, how those tools get deployed. And as with everything, education, the beginning, middle, and the end of so much of this, preschool, the financial inclusion, the digital inclusion, the financial education, the digital education should start at that point and run right for all of our lives. Jumping right to the regulator level, I believe the FCA has a key role when it comes to financial inclusion. I suggested amendments to that effect in the Financial Services Bill. The government weren't in listening mode on that. I also suggested that the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England has a role to play when it comes to financial inclusion. If we consider what's happened over the past year with COVID, I think we have 407 billion reasons to reconsider all of the concepts, all of the approaches. When we consider the concept of financial stability, which is the role of the FPC, I think it's not too much of a mental leap to suggest that financial inclusion, as part of that consideration of the overall financial stability of the economy, would be an incredibly positive thing. The Bank of England, with such a reputation in this country, revered around the world, that reputation, that brand, that position could be put to such great effect, playing their part as well in the financial inclusion journey. I also consider that there's a disparity in terms of how investments and debt are currently treated. It was interesting yesterday listening to Nicola Rathie doing the keynote at Fintech Day 2, where he rightly identified that consumers looking at investment products online should have the same protection, the same rules as operate in the non-online space, of course. But why wouldn't that same logic apply when it comes to debt? There's a tragic, horrific industry going on right now called lead generators, effectively online businesses sweeping up people who look for debt advice already in dire straits through no fault of their own, getting swept up, sold on by these companies, often being charged for the privilege of being connected to organizations holding themselves out, misrepresenting themselves as debt advice services. Why shouldn't that have at least the same protection, the same rules as when consumers go to invest? Similarly, as we already heard from Alice, access to cash is such an important issue. Cash still matters, and it matters materially to millions. It's why I put an amendment down to have cash back without a purchase. And on this point, excuse me, it's worn me out, all this talking, it's worn me out. On this point, the government were in listening mode, and we got that amendment through on Monday evening. Why is this important? It's because if we don't address the current cash network, it could crumble within a year. Cash is declining, and declining in terms of ATM withdrawals by over 50% in the last 2 years. We need to bolster that cash network. So cash back without a purchase, I see as a key part of that. It's a step. It's not the complete picture, of course it's not, but it's a step. And through that, potentially you could start to look at ideas such as digital pounds through a similar network, local cryptocurrencies, keeping the wealth, keeping the capital within region to really drive at the levelling up agenda, driving financial inclusion, driving digital inclusion. Again, as Marlies mentioned, regional mutual banks could play such a key role here. I put an amendment down to this effect. Yes, a physical presence in a region, but an online presence and a mobile presence, driving financial inclusion, driving digital inclusion, keeping capital within region, speaking to place-based growth and the levelling up agenda. Such potential. As we've concluded the Financial Services Bill, there have been some successes, certainly in some amendments which have been agreed, certainly in getting a lot of the issues out there. Still a huge amount to be done though in terms of understanding the issues around access to digital payments, how we can further enable and include, how we can drive a public debate around all this stuff, because everything needs to pass two tests, it seems to me. What's in it for me, correctly asked and correctly constructed, and the biggest question of all, no matter how good the technology is, no matter how good a policy is, no matter how good a product is, if it can't pass the so what test, then it's going nowhere. So I believe, in conclusion, we are at a moment We have great potential, but not an inevitability. But it's in all our hands, and it's beholden on all of us to do everything we can to push financial inclusion, digital inclusion, the social inclusion and well-being, sense of community and connection, which will come from that, could truly enable us to say in 5 years, in 10 years, and in decades to come, when it was asked of us and when the moment came, coming out of COVID, yes, we did indeed build back better.
Chris, thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on your successful amendment recently. It's always nice to see good things happening in Parliament. You mentioned a couple of challenges that need to be addressed: digital ID, inclusion, both financial and digital. I think one of the frustrations or difficulties is that there's a multi-departmental approach to these issues across government. There isn't one central body or department responsible for it. You've got some things happening at Treasury, things happening at the Department for Culture and Media, the FCA does something. I've got two questions for you. The first is, do you think there needs to be a much more holistic approach within government with regards to digital inclusion and financial inclusion? And also, do you think Marluce's point around there needs to be a separate review on fintech and these issues, do you think that would be a good approach as well?
Thank you very much. The holy grail and the pressing need with this and with so many other issues is to think horizontal rather than vertical, to think a golden thread running through the whole of Whitehall and beyond, rather than just individual siloed departments. In some ways, I would say this, wouldn't I? I think the only time we really had true cross Whitehall working was when we planned and delivered the London 2012 Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. And you see it again now with some of the excellent elements of the COVID response, not least the vaccine program. It's really positive, truly, that we have a financial inclusion minister in Guy Opperman. It's on his job spec, that's a good thing, linked to John Glenn's responsibilities for financial inclusion at the Treasury. That is undoubtedly positive, but we need more cross-Whitehall, horizontal leadership and the cultural change which will come from that. To Marlise's point, absolutely, but I'd also put that in a broader context that we need to look at all of the new technologies, potentially in segmented pieces of work, but all of them in this sense. And it's why I did a report in 2017 on distributed ledger technology for public good, and the bit after the colon, at least as important, leadership, collaboration, innovation. But that sense of looking at the public good and indeed quite rightly the private good from fintech and from all of these technologies has to be the way forward, because it's not about building better, more efficient, real-time systems for transaction and exchange. This is about having systems which can enable and assist and turbocharge relationships and indeed be a builder of, a creator of, a driver of value rather than just an exchanger of it.
And before we move on to Kate, if I could just ask you a specific question about the Kalifa review. There was a very encouraging section on financial inclusion in the Kalifa review in Kay's chapter. Do you think that the Kalifa review should have included more on financial inclusion? And as a second question, I always like getting two in for one. Are you concerned that so far the Chancellor hasn't mentioned financial inclusion with regards to Kalifa, or do you expect him to mention financial inclusion within Kalifa, as things develop?
I think the financial inclusion agenda was well positioned in Kay's chapter, and as with everything, can we do more? Yes. Do we need to do more? Yes. Will we do more? Absolutely. I think you'll see a lot more and hear a lot more from the Chancellor when he makes the full response to Kalifa. But it's, as you've rightly identified, it's an element, an incredibly important element of Kalifa, but it goes way, way beyond that. And it's an issue for all of us in everything that we do. And again, it's only one element of inclusion. And again, to thoroughly and firmly underscore the point, financial exclusion and digital exclusion all too often walking the same path. We need to break into that. We have the solutions, we have the tools to do it. Action is now required. And I think the Kalifa review is a really important piece in that overall perspective.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Loads of questions coming through on the chat. Thank you very much. We will get to them, I promise. Polite request from the facilitator. If you could keep the question to a question in the chat, just makes it a little bit easier to decipher and put forward to our panelists. I'd now like to invite Dr. Kay Swinburne to provide a few words. Kay is Vice Chair of Financial Services at KPMG in the UK. She was formerly, for a decade, MEP for Wales, where she was Vice Chair on the European Parliament's influential Economics and Monetary Affairs Committee, and as discussed, she led the Policy and Regulation chapter of the Kalifa Review. So, Kate, really appreciate you joining us today. Could you give us a few words on, how you feel this discussion's gone, but also the Kalifa Review and financial inclusion?
Absolutely, David, and thank you for the invitation here this morning. And being able to talk about this report rather than just seeing it in black and white is important, because what's in that report is what we were asked to deliver, which was, how do we make sure that the UK's fintech sector is the most competitive in the world? And that was the objective that we had, and so that report plays to that. It's actually formulated around that, meeting that objective. But what you need to I guess understand is how we got to those conclusions, particularly, and I am going to talk much more about the policy and regulation chapter, because they were run as separate teams. So when Bon Kalifa was asked to set this up, he decided that there were 5 areas that he needed to actually focus on, and he could break it down into these 5 different areas. So policy and regulation was one of them, and an important part of it. The skills and future training was another. International was another. Investment and connectivity were the other chapters in it, and we call them chapters. So each chapter had a chairman, and each chairman then had a team to support them. So a deputy chair, and then a team of secretariat to support those activities. And companies throughout the city, professional services and financial services, have given resources to staff this. And from that point of view, I do feel it may be industry-led, but to be fair, they're the only ones who've got the capacity and the resources to give the time that this needed. And I have just spent the last 8 months working on this. I can't tell you how many weekends we've given up, how many sort of late nights through into early hours we have spent trying to get this done. But the reality is, when we sat down as the policy and regulation team, we decided that we needed to actually think about a thread that ran through everything. And those threads for us, the 2 really big threads, were the financial inclusion argument and sustainability. We decided that they were so central to the future of financial services in this country that we needed to have them as a central tenet. And so much so that even when we talk about introducing a digital finance package, the example we use is that, I'm going to read the line here. The recommendation was deliver a digital finance package that creates a new regulatory framework for emerging technology. The UK must prioritise new areas for growth and cross-industry challenges, such as financial inclusion. It was there front and centre as our first recommendation up there in the report. It was in Ron's introductory remarks as being the thread that holds this together. And what I can tell you is that we started off by talking, we set up 7 initial roundtables, 6 of which were industry-led. We divided up the industry into various different groups, and we had people who actually had social inclusion at their heart as a business model. We had sustainability and some of the other companies that were selected to be part of those roundtables. We thought carefully that we had that cross-representation in those initial roundtables. So we had 7 initial roundtables, 6 of which were industry, as I say, selected to make sure we had the social inclusive providers in there and the sustainability, but also we had one with the regulators. And obviously the FCA has got a consumer focus. And so we spent a lot of time in that regulatory roundtable actually setting the parameters for how we can actually make this the most inclusive of recommendations and policy set that we could. After doing those initial 7 roundtables, it was very obvious to us that we needed a lot more information and a lot more involvement of more people. So we did hundreds of bilateral follow-ups, both individually and collectively, and 11 more deep dives. So we went into these subjects in detail. We then actually decided we had a relatively small universe of 220 companies we were working with. We decided to extend that and actually put out a questionnaire. And instead of putting that questionnaire out, for example, to the mailing list of the City of London Corporation or Innovate Finance mailing list, we decided to actually put it out on social media much more generally. And, you know, for those of you who know my background in politics and, you know, being an MEP, I felt it really, really important that I reached out as far and wide as I possibly could to try and make sure we got responses outside of the usual suspects. So that questionnaire was put up for several weeks and we encouraged as many people as possible to respond to it. And I can tell you, we had essays of responses on each and every question we answered, asked that weren't closed questions and weren't just a tick box. This is, prioritizing what you want. Anything that was an open question, we had essays on. So we read every single one of them and hopefully have tried to incorporate the themes and the guts of this in what we've done. We were asked to produce 3 recommendations. We didn't. We decided we had to do a comprehensive piece of work. And, we were asked, given that social inclusion was put as, a topic, financial inclusion was put as a topic, as a theme throughout, could we just get rid of that as a separate section within the final written report to save word count? And we argued against it and said, no, this is really important. And even though it does run horizontally, we think it needs to have at least some prominence as a topic in its own right. The same with the ESG. Sustainability was something that runs throughout, but we felt it needed prominence. It needed to be maintained with a separate heading so people could see it had some thought and attention put to it. What it doesn't give you is the sense of how universal this was, how we really do care about this. And I can tell you both myself and my deputy, Rachel Kent, have done a lot of work to try and make sure that we have tried to point government in the right direction. So we make recommendations. The policy is written by government. And so it's that next step that is critically important. And I would urge everybody on this call who's got a view to now actually use the legislative process, that consultation process that has to come with every legislative change. And, they say they're going to recommend, that they will take up many of these recommendations, but they can't until they've done a public consultation, until they've gone out to do the formal legislative process. And that's when I really hope all of the people on this call will really take it seriously and really build in this type of civil society's response into that consultation. It was the only way we got good legislation in Brussels, was to make sure that everyone responded to consultations. And for me, when I look at in Brussels, civil society actually are major contributors to the way EU legislation is written and crafted and actually finalized, because you cannot ignore the responses you get in from a very organized civil society sector. And so I would urge the UK, given that we are changing from EU rules where it was all done centrally to now being UK only, you need to engage and you need to do it at that consultation process stage, and also get the regulators on side. As Lord Holmes has just pointed out, the Bank of England and ministers and the FCA have got a mandate for financial inclusivity. They've got a mandate for sustainability and climate change. So use them. use them to actually make sure that all of these things are front and center when the laws are then crafted, when the policies are put in place, when the changes are made. So for me, there are some big things in here that, you know, maybe because it's such a comprehensive chapter, you're probably quite lucky. It started off as 47 pages long. Ron Kalifa asked us to shrink it. We shrunk it down to 25 and eventually got to 17 in a final reorganization before it was published. What we are doing, however, Rachel Kent and myself have decided this is too important to leave. There are some big topics that we believe still need further working on. And one of them is the financial inclusion sector. We actually don't believe we've got enough concrete ideas as to what needs to happen in terms of policy and then the actual legislative changes that might need to be made. And so we are proposing another deep dive that we will do in the coming weeks, where we will actually put out a paper as a result of it, where we will hopefully have some more concrete proposals in much more depth, which will not be restricted by word count. And you know, we're doing it for AI, we're doing it for a whole load of other areas in here as well. But we just believe that reporting it once and putting the review out there is just the start. There is so much more to be done. And we believe quite passionately in all of these topics and think that we really can make a difference and can hold, you know, politicians to account over this and how they take it forwards. And the regulators, I have to say, have been an absolute breath of fresh air. So they get a lot of criticism in the press, they get a lot of criticism generally out there. But the reality for me is that they could not have been more helpful to us in trying to shape what this looks like and what the future needs to look like for that inclusive society and building back better. So, you know, we've got a future regulatory framework. We suggest to the government that they need to look in depth at things like the payment sector. They need to make sure that it doesn't exclude people, that it actually really does work for all consumers and gives protection in the same way as if you were going through your bank to make a payment. So they need to protect consumers on that. You know, and if that means changing the regulatory envelope, the perimeter, to include tech companies who currently, you know, my children I know have got balances sitting on their various computer pay apps on their phones, which are not protected at all for any consumer protection that their bank would offer them or any other licensed provider. So I think it's going to be important that, you know, payments are looked at, future crypto assets are looked at. There are people investing in crypto assets right now with no regulatory sort of support around them and certainly no protection. I do believe that we need to right size our legislation. That means looking at it from every perspective. And I've also, within that future regulatory framework, we've included the ESG and separately the financial inclusion sections because they need more work and they need to be included in that future financial framework generally that the UK is putting together. The government did respond this week with the digitisation of financial services, two areas that keep the UK at the leading edge of future advances in digitised financial markets. In particular, it will be the central bank digital currency. Again, the bank will be leading on that work, and they do have a financial inclusion requirement to look at. And I think the court members will ensure that they adhere to that. Because if you're going to replace any of cash and future payments with some form of token from the central bank, you need to make sure it's actually fit for purpose for everyone and that it doesn't disadvantage anybody. So that task force that's been set up between the Bank of England and the HMT teams will also include two work groups, two forums, where they have already stated that they will include civic society, that they will include the third sector. So I think, you know, you need to make sure that you put nominees forwards for those forums to make sure that they hit the ground running on day one and that they can get those messages in straight away to make sure that these are really fit for purpose. The visa point, I mean, I understand, you know, from one of the questions in the chat there, that there are concerns that you might need to and want to make these more conditioned. Well, I suspect they will be, is the honest answer to that. What I'm hearing at the moment is this whole thread of sustainability is running through the whole Build Back Better agenda of government. So I think, you know, it's right to push for it, but I think it's an open door. I think they are minded now to condition in the way that they're conditioning sustainable finance, they're conditioning government lending, they're going to be conditioning all sorts of things. If companies participate in the scheme, they have to in future actually say they will adhere to higher climate change sustainability goals. And indeed, I think they should be going further in terms of things. If it involves financial inclusion or could involve financial inclusion, it should be up there in the sustainability. And by the way, I do think the S component of ESG has got a huge part of that is financial inclusion and inclusion more generally. So I could talk all day on this. You know, we've got things on trade policy, the scale box, the way the FCA is going to approach and handle companies going forwards. Even in the scale box, they talk about prioritizing in the government's response the sustainable element to this, and making sure that that is actually one of the big priorities for the scale box time going forwards. So, you know, the digital box, sandbox that they're putting forwards, green and sustainable will be prioritized over everything else that's in that digital sandbox. So I'm actually quite optimistic at this point that we've had an overwhelmingly positive response from industry. We've had an overwhelmingly positive response from incumbents in financial services who could have been threatened by this, but are seemingly embracing it. And government in this last week has really surprised me by how many things they've already announced that they are actually taking on board and now running consultations on in order to actually enact change. So a slightly different perspective to the one that you started with, Malus, but you know, I do think, having lived and breathed this for 8 months and know how many people we've reached out to, the way in which we try to conduct ourselves to try and make sure we have been as inclusive as possible, it doesn't come through, I understand, when you read those 17 pages. If you'd read the 47, it might have come through a little more, but actually if we'd included methodology, it hopefully would have given people a little more confidence to know that this had actually been, as Lord Holmes referred to, a golden thread running through everything that we've done.
Thanks so much, Kate. I had like a call for action ready for the end of the session, but I think you've beaten me to it and provided a much better one. The work you mentioned that you're doing on financial inclusion, AI, and what more needs to be done, is that coming through KPMG or is that coming through Kalifa review? And is there kind of a formal process for people to get involved with that?
So at this point in time, the Kalifa review has served it's done, as it were. It's produced the report, the recommendations have been made to government. It's now for government and agencies to take this forwards. However, I know that Ron Kalifa is not going to step away. He is passionate about actually trying to make sure that this is followed through. So I would hope that Ron is involved in the CFIT, the Centre for Financial Innovation and Technology. I would hope that he will have a role there driving this forwards. Ron is also part of the new Digital Economy Council that has been set up by Oliver Dowden. And so, you know, a lot of what he will be taking forwards will be this inclusive agenda and talking about how we make this work. He's passionate also about the digital ID component of this. And so many of us are trying to work out how we can assist government and private sector to come together in order to actually make that happen, because it needs both sides to work on this. Both have got data, both need to do this in a way that the data is protected and at no point is that data compromised because you've created weaknesses in the system. So individuals' data and corporate data needs the highest level of regard. And if government works with the private sector, you're actually going to find that you're going to get a better solution than them doing two separate things with the two different data sets that they actually have as two entities. So yes, it's been done more privately rather than, there's no formal role for the Kalifa review to continue. It will be the CFIT entity that will take forwards a lot of the initiatives. But in terms of the policy and regulation side, because part of my day job is advising my clients on policy and regulation, my firm have been very generous with their time to allow me to continue to develop some of these themes and to make sure that we can feed into the system. Rachel at Hogan Lovells has got the same mandate. She works in policy and regulation as part of her day job, and therefore she also is able to extend her mandate somewhat so that we can do these types of meetings. By all means, reach out to us. I mean, my email address, I'm more than welcome to reach out to me either through LinkedIn or through my my corporate email address. We would, we are inclusive. We will have anybody come and participate in these sessions. So by all means, if you have a theme you want us to pursue, either in person or you just want to feed into us in written form, just please use us. So Rachel Kent is at Hogan Lovells and I'm at KPMG. So by all means, utilize us, because we've not let this go yet. And we work a lot with Lord Holmes. So I can tell you, I mean, sort of Chris is a huge advocate in this space, and we've been trying to make sure that we use him in the House of Lords to make sure that as and when policy needs raising, that he has that channel to do so, and so we can help feed things into him too.
Thanks, Kate. And perhaps the lab can play a role in coordinating some civil society responses to you. We've only got 25 minutes left, and there's loads of questions coming through. So I'm just going to start rattling off some of these, and I'm sure we'll cross on these topics again. Well, Kate, I'll start with you on this one, and then maybe Chris, you can add some comments. A lot of questions looking at how do we measure the social good of a company, and how do we make sure that fintech is being socially useful. Combination of fintech and big data and a profit motive. What can be done to make sure that leads to greater inclusion? Kate, if I can start with you.
So I mean, there are specific fintech companies out there whose sole reason for being is to actually pursue this social agenda. So I mean, not all companies are there for the profit. So I mean, first and foremost, that needs to be said. And we did have a number of companies who had social purpose at their heart rather than profit making. So fintech is a broad church. And so I don't want to actually just talk only about those companies who are only there to further their own shareholders or indeed their founders' pockets. So that's not universal, and we need to acknowledge that. The other side of this is that actually, for me, the regulators and policymakers have got a huge role to play. They are the ones who set the guardrails here, and they are the ones who actually set the way in which they expect firms licensed and authorized to operate in the UK financial services sector can do so. And they are capable and able to actually set the bar higher if they feel that's appropriate. And so, companies at both ends of the spectrum, those with a social purpose and those who purely have a profit motive, either side, I'm not judging them, but actually I think policymakers and regulators actually play the role in holding them to account and making sure they do their bit. And it's up to us to make sure that our policymakers understand where the weight of society is in supporting certain initiatives and going further in certain regards. And I feel very strongly that the ESG data, TCFD disclosures by the largest companies going down to smaller companies is a great start, but it's a start. TCFD is climate change disclosures. I want all companies operating of any size in the UK to make ESG disclosures where the S is just as important as the E, and that they take into account what their role in society is and how they impact the communities that they are operating in. And if you really look at what S should be defined as, it's a very broad mantle. And I think corporate UK should actually get used to the idea that they are going to have to make much higher disclosures in the future, and not just disclosures, the acknowledgement that they have an impact on the communities and the society that they exist within, and that they have to actually try, if it's a negative impact, they have to try and mitigate it. If it's actually a positive impact, how can they do even more? And I genuinely think that, if anything comes out of COVID-19, it's that sense of community and an enhanced sense of society and doing things better. And I just hope that government seizes that support that I certainly feel out there when I talk about these issues amongst corporates. I hope that they can harness your team here and the thoughts and actually go bigger, bolder, better.
Thank you very much, Kate. Chris, I'll come to you now. Any comments on making sure fintech as a whole is socially useful? There's been a couple of suggestions in the chat here of the FCA having an explicit mandate to, it's just moved on from me there, specific mandate to promote fair access and prevent discrimination and exclusion, and perhaps the creation of a digital conduct authority?
I think to look at the opportunity piece first, there's a great opportunity not just for fintechs to be shown to be leading in this space, but fintech of itself, through some of the companies that exist today, have the potential to set out, be it an investment firm, be it a corporate, to set out every element of what that fund, what that corporate does across the ESG issues. SDGs are a helpful piece in this. Good to have something which has been universally agreed. It's not the complete picture, but there really is the opportunity now in real time to be able to assess and have dashboard data at anyone's fingertips to see what an organization, what a fund, what an investment is doing across any of the measures that you choose. So the potential is there. It's no mean challenge, but it is a challenge and it is achievable. And it should be what we seek to get to, because going down to the micro level, to startups, whenever I meet with founders, fintech founders, they always, every single one of them, talk about this sense of purpose, this sense of opportunity, and a real, within themselves, commitment to all the things that we may define as ESG, SDG, all of those inclusive elements. It's just there within them. So we should feel confident, not Panglossian, not rose-tinted speckies, but we should feel confident that there is one heck of a potential here, but it requires all partners to come together. And again, that key convening power, that key leadership power of government to be very much at the fore.
Marlus, hello Marlus, it's been nearly an hour since we've heard from you, I do apologise. Some comments on the social good, and I'm going to just throw this in here. One of the big news stories recently has been Greensill and the kind of dark interactions that have been happening between the private sector and government. Greensill essentially is a fintech, it offered a finance app. Any comments on how we can not let Greensill happen again?
Sure, yeah. So I think first I'd say I completely agree that there are fintechs out there who have social environmental purpose at the heart of what they're doing. And at the lab, we run an incubator program for fintechs like that. But I would say that they are the minority, and that we are still not good enough at really measuring the impact of fintech on people. And that does lead to organizations like Greensill, which is an extreme example maybe, but it, being able to claim that it's making finance fairer and being backed by very powerful people like David Cameron and having access to the NHS, and ultimately failing and costing the NHS money. And I think what we need to do, like Mick McAteer from the Financial Inclusion Centre mentioned this in the chat, we really need to look at what is the impact of fintech as a system on society. And there I think, calls from Chris around the Bank of England playing a monitoring role to understand how innovation is really impacting people's lives are really important. And I think, fintech isn't going to solve every financial inclusion problem. And tech isn't, and we've got some really old problems in finance that we need to overcome as well. For example, I think in the UK we really need to think more about what's the role of non-profit business models in serving people who aren't going to make a big profit. Firms aren't going to make a profit from them, but we still need to give them access to essential financial services. So I think that's something we need a wider debate about. But then I think the use of data presents new problems for tackling financial exclusion. And I think we need to discuss, do we really need to know how often someone texts their mum to decide whether we give them credit, for example, which is something, some apps look at? Or do we really want firms using our financial data to then sell adverts? I think those are the sorts of questions we really need to be discussing. I don't see us discussing those very much anywhere. Yeah, and I just want to say thanks so much to Kay for, you're a huge champion of financial inclusion, and we'd love to work with you and Rachel as you develop that paper. So it'd be great to think about how we might feed into that and also share it with the people on this call, so that, yeah, we can get as much input as possible.
Thanks, Marlus. We're talking a lot here about how civil society can get more involved with the policy-making process and these consultations. One of the most consistent comments I think we hear is that a lot of it's a resource issue. Third sector and civil society organisations don't have the resources of larger firms, so they may not be able to respond to every consultation, particularly when there seems to have been a consultation a week since 2019 in a very similar area. A question came up from someone asking about talking about their experience with open banking. I'm just going to come through it to there's often a mismatch in understanding and cultures of how the third sector works vis-a-vis the private sector. So there's a risk of the third sector getting left behind. The question, Kay, is how do we upskill the third sector and local communities in the race to digitalisation and in adopting new tech?
So for those of you who ever lobbied in Brussels, I'm about to offer you a huge compliment, because I think the sector that actually lobbies Brussels the best is the third sector. They're incredibly organised, they're incredibly collaborative. They actually join forces in very different areas in order to actually push forwards their agenda. And they do it incredibly successfully. So, I would actually suggest learning from some of those third sectors who actually really do lobby for, sort of things in the European system. And many of them are UK individuals who used to come out to Brussels to see me and others involved in legislation. So I would suggest that there are some very experienced lobbying entities in the third sector that have learned their craft in Brussels that will actually be able to help train those who've never had to do it in Brussels because they've been domestic focused, and now actually apply those exactly the same way that they lobby in Brussels will work in Westminster. And I think they just need to make sure that their voices are heard. In Brussels, you would never do a piece of legislation as the rapporteur without making sure that a third of your time was spent on the third sector, getting their opinions, making sure that you understand where the concerns are and that you've actually taken them into account. Sometimes it's not obvious you have, and people still complain, but you do actually listen. And if you don't, you get absolutely hammered within the European system for not doing so. So the reality is you've got people who do know. And so the large charities in the UK who've done European lobbying, I would ask them to run some training programs more generally, because they are absolutely brilliant at it. And, for all the money that some of the private sector put at this, I can tell you financial services lobbying was absolutely dire, because they never have a common goal. They all compete against one another to the point they can't collaborate. So actually financial services, I would say to you, on any specific piece of legislation, never ever got where they needed to get to, because there was never one, they were never even on the same page, let alone actually asking for the exact same thing. So on that basis, third sector tends to be much more organized, much more collaborative, and therefore actually yield results. So I would have confidence that you have got a strong message. People want to hear it. There isn't a politician that I've met on any side of the house, to be fair, that would actually dismiss the third sector's voice on any topic they want to raise.
Lord Holmes, any comments on that? But also, I'd like to put this question to you, which is, what are the tensions of building back better domestically and maintaining UK competitiveness globally? How do we address the tensions effectively and quickly deliver financial and digital inclusion?
On the first point, just to add to what Kay said, I think we can reimagine how we do consultations, how we do policy, how we do legislation in this country for a digital, potentially real-time environment. certainly there's a lot more in terms of, if you will, onboarding that consultation at the experimentation, at the unfully formed stage. And that could be incredibly helpful in terms of the creativity which will come from that and an increased sense of co-production. On the second point, I think that if structured correctly, there shouldn't be a tension between these two things. It's sort of the debate, if you sort of put it in a slightly different context, it's always falsely constructed that there's a tension between standards and competitiveness. Whereas in reality, if you get your standards right and you get there, if not first, certainly at the front of the pack, standards become a brilliant driver for competitiveness, for edge, for reliability, for certainty, for economic and social growth. Just look at the laws of England and Wales and the rule of law and how powerful that is internationally, that you can be in Senegal contracting a commercial contract and that contract will be done under English law. That's a fabulous strength that we have. When put into the digital and the fintech context, we really need to ensure that all those things are threaded together so they're all complementary and they're all assistive. And it shouldn't be in any sense that there is a tension between these two things, because if we look at financial inclusion specifically of itself, even if, and it's a shame that some people may think this, but even if people only conceive of this from the economic perspective, well, that's a fully formed and totally positively made argument that financial inclusion makes economic sense in its own terms. So I don't think there is any tension between the two. I think not just nationally, we need to drive this regional piece. As Marcel's correctly said, the case for regional mutual banks, I think, is incredibly well made. So it's not about the UK potentially versus the rest of the world with this tension. It's a sense of collaborative, creative growth in regions of the UK, in nations of the UK, and in a globally connected real-time world.
Thanks, Chris. Marlus, I'll ask you the same two questions. The first is, how do we deal with this skills gap with regards to the third sector becoming more involved with policy making, but also the domestic versus international competitiveness agenda?
Great, thank you. So on the first question, I think they're definitely, we need resourcing really as a third sector, I think, to really be able to participate in these discussions and to have the capacity to do so. And I think there's also something about, I really love what Chris just said about experimenting with that process for consultations. And I've experienced, for example, running an incubator and co-designing innovations as part of that with people with lived experience of problem debt. And I and the innovators and those people with lived experience all learned so much from one another through that process. And something we learned that was so valuable is that the earlier you bring together those people to share expertise, the better the outcomes. So yeah, I really think we could do more like that with policy making too. And we've seen other experiments like with citizens' assemblies, for example, and the Bank of England has its citizens panel now as well. So I think we can really build on those ideas. But I think alongside thinking about the process, we also need to think about purpose. And this was a lesson from open banking, really, where because open banking was always about competition, it meant that there wasn't always a mandate to really involve consumer groups and civil society organizations in the development of open banking. And actually, just as an example, the end users that were described for open banking actually meant the firms working with open banking, not the consumers or the businesses who you'd think might be the ultimate beneficiary of open banking. So that was a real limitation for us and something we'd like to see changed going forward, so that the mandate for open banking, its objective, and for open finance is to improve outcomes for consumers and businesses. And yeah, I'm feeling very inspired about what more we can do in the UK to to learn from the situation in Brussels as powers come to London. That's something we definitely want to work on at the lab, and think about how we can really strengthen civil society and continue to work with parliamentarians and Chris to make sure that any new legislation really works for the public. I think what I'd say about again, there's a question of resources. In the EU, they funded civil society organisations to help hold the industry to account, and in the UK we don't have that at the moment. And then just on domestic versus international objectives, I think this is such a juicy question at the moment, and I think it's worth remembering that in 2012 competitiveness was taken out of the objectives of the regulators because it was understood that that had contributed to the global financial crisis. So I think we need to keep that in mind as the government and industry push for competitiveness again, because I think there's a real risk that if that's the priority, financial innovation could again lead to systemic risks and to harm to consumers. So I think the ultimate objective should be, how do we improve society and the environment? How can finance act in service of that? And from there will flow a world-class financial system that has high standards and really delivers social value.
Thanks, Marlies. We're running out of time, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. But I tell you what, Kay, do you want any succinct kind of last couple of points you'd like to make? And I'll offer the same to Chris before we wrap up.
So for me, it's about the opportunity. I mean, the FinTech review is about how do we actually get a competitive UK landscape that means more jobs, more trade, and effectively having a more inclusive society. Those are the three things I think we get out of this FinTech report if it's actually implemented correctly. And I think there is just as much emphasis on all of those. We need good jobs, we need good ethical trade, and we need a proper inclusive society in terms of the opportunities for everybody. I think if the UK government manages to get on the front foot here, they can really make a big difference. They can build in the criteria that Marlies, you were asking for in terms of visas. They can build in the criteria for future funding from government. They can build in these things. And actually, I think it's a great idea that's in there that, you know, I mean, I've just been reminded by Mick, who's been in the chat box, very active there. Finance Watch was actually funded by the EU in its early days of the financial crisis. And I understand recently the European Financial Inclusion Network's been folded into it of late. So that is a funded body that actually oversees the third sector and pulls it all together, and it gives them a budget to do it. So maybe the UK does need to look at potentially putting its own Finance Watch equivalent into to make sure the voices are heard properly.
Thanks, Kay. And building on that, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone in the chat. It's been really brilliant. I'm sorry we didn't get around to everyone, but I hope we got some of the main themes into today's discussion. Chris, any final comments from you before we wrap up?
Firstly, thanks to you and the lab for this invitation, this great event. Thanks to everybody who has been online. Great to see so many friends as participants and in the chat space. Do keep connected, link in me, Twitter me, email me, be retro, telephone me, but do be in touch with any ideas. This is about a debate, and the more perspectives we have in there, so much the better. And finally, it's just this. What is finance? What is finance for? It's either about enabling, empowering, putting the funding into a mission and a purpose, unleashing potential. If it's not inclusive, it's not very much at all. And when we have financial inclusion, digital inclusion, so much can flow from that in terms of social inclusion, mental well-being, connected communities, place-based growth, an economy, a society, communities, cities, and a country that we can truly say, when it came to post-COVID, we built back better.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. What brilliant event. Kay, Chris, thank you so much. Thank you as well, Marlies. I'm going to ask everyone now to turn on their cameras because we're going to get a screenshot of all our attendees. So everyone turn on your cameras, show yourselves, and then when we go into the gallery view, my colleague Yvonne, who's been an absolute tech superstar today, will take a screenshot. So everybody wave at Yvonne. Hi Yvonne, get us in there. Call to action. Well, you've heard one from Kate. Let's connect everyone up with Kate for the next steps of her work. On Twitter, you can share our report lifting the lid, or you can share our response to Kalifa review. You can find it on our website. Hashtag UKFW21 to be part of UK Fintech Week. Get in touch with us about how civil society can be involved with this discussion. And as always, we welcome feedback on our events, so please don't be shy. That's all from me, and that's all from the lab. Thanks once more, and we will be in touch again very soon. Goodbye.